Okay, I'm watching Forensic Files right now. Because I like listening to it in the background instead of music.
26-year-old Michelle Salerno, a graduate student studying speech pathology, went missing. She didn't show up at a family picnic, and she wasn't answering her telephone.
And so I called the East Lansing Police Department to do an apartment check. They could go over and check, and they went over there and she wasn't there.
Michelle lived in an apartment just off campus.
Yeah, you are.
Signs of violent crime occurring in the apartment or anything. It looked like a college student's apartment.
But they did find two suspicious things. There was evidence around the doorknob already to suggest lock picking.
There was a regular-sized couch in the living room of the apartment, and the three top cushions of that couch were missing.
And Michelle's car, a burgundy station wagon, was not in the apartment parking lot.
There were 6 or 7 different law enforcement agencies involved, most of whom had no actual stake in the case themselves, but volunteered people to participate in the search. There were also civilians who volunteered. There were
Okay.
university staff and employees who supported the search. There were private citizens that assisted.
Police issued a be on the lookout call for Michelle's car. 100 miles away, police in Toledo, Ohio found it parked near the bus station. They had ticketed the car several times, an indication it had been there for a while. No one recalled seeing Michelle Salerno in or near the car.
We didn't really think it was good news because she wasn't with it. And why would it be in Toledo, Ohio? It just didn't make any sense.
Michelle Salerno was separated from her husband, Dennis. When she disappeared, Dennis was living in Bowling Green, Ohio, and claimed he hadn't seen her in over a week. The last known person to see Michelle alive was her next-door neighbor, Jason. He said she helped him deliver some newspapers several days earlier.
She had just recently picked up a burglary paper route, basically to earn a little extra cash. If I recall correctly, the paper route went from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Jason said he and Michelle returned to their respective apartments around 6 o'clock that morning, and that was the last time he saw her.
Jason was considered a suspect for the simple fact he was the last person to see Michelle alive before her disappearance.
Jason and Michelle were actually close friends. They had formed a relationship, not anything outside of friendship, but the relationship was tight.
Based on all of the circumstances in our follow-up investigation, we were able to quickly locate him as a suspect.
I checked in every one of Michelle's credit cards. None of those things ever showed any activity whatsoever on them. Her checking account, everything had stopped, like Michelle just had disappeared, and everything about her had just ended.
But people who disappear usually spend money, so investigators feared this was something far worse. Shortly after Michelle Salerno's disappearance, there was another suspicious incident in Ohio a
Hi.
few miles from Michelle's abandoned car. A truck driver was murdered in a rest stop bathroom.
The victim was located on the floor of the shower. His throat had been cut. He was not clothed. Some of his personal belongings were there in the shower.
The man was identified as 50-year-old Larry McClanahan, a self-employed trucker from Ohio. A background check revealed McClanahan served time in prison for sexually assaulting his 14-year-old nephew. His cellmate and best friend was none other than Dennis Salerno, Michelle Salerno's estranged husband, who had served time for theft and fraud.
After getting out of prison, Salerno went to live with McClanahan and his family for a period of time, so they were well acquainted.
McClanahan opened his door to Dennis to a place to live, and also came out that Larry and Dennis shared Larry's wife. McClanahan's ex-wife informed us that they were all sexually involved together.
The truck stop security camera showed McClanahan walking towards the shower room with another man carrying a large large black bag. A half hour later, the man with the bag left without McClanahan. To police, the man looked like Dennis Salerno.
There was also a video which shows Salerno entering a locked and secured storage area. There were clear pictures taken there.
Did you kill Larry? Why would I kill Larry?
When police brought Salerno in for questioning, he denied everything. But after several hours, his story changed. He said McClanahan called him a few days earlier suggesting they meet at the truck stop. Salerno said when he got there, McClanahan admitted he, quote, took care of his wife, Michelle, since he knew Salerno was having marital problems.
Dennis said, what do you mean? McClanahan said, I took care of your wife. He said to him, I've taken care of your problem, Dennis. Now come over here, take your clothes off, and get in the shower with me.
Salerno claimed McClanahan wouldn't take no for an answer and feared he would be raped.
Dennis said he panicked, reached down and grabbed a knife, jabbed it backwards where McClanahan was, and stabbed him in the neck.
I think he was trying to part of the expression kill two birds with one stone. He was trying to implicate McClanahan as the murderer of Michelle and also extricate himself from McClanahan's murder by claiming that it was self-defense.
But police were skeptical. First, the physical evidence did not support Salerno's version of events.
We later found out that McClanahan's neck was slashed here, and he was almost decapitated.
It appears clear that McClanahan was in a vulnerable position, that his throat was cut probably from behind. He has defensive wounds indicating that he was fighting off a knife attack. That's not something that falls in line with Salerno's description.
And Salerno admitted he didn't ask McClanahan for details about Michelle's murder.
And still, I had to ask Dennis, well, did you ask him what he did with her, or how he killed her, or where she's at? Dennis never asked those questions. Yes, you know why we're talking about it. You're the only one who knows Michelle.
How can I do that? How can I do that? I don't know who she is. I told you guys everything that I know. I told you about all the friends that I knew that she had.
Dennis, thank you very much for that statement. That's not a very powerful. Detective Vincent and I took the tape of Dennis to some social media profiler. And one of the things that came out is that if he did murder Michelle, more than likely he would bury her, take her someplace, that they had some connection together.
While Salerno admitted killing McClanahan, he denied any involvement in Michelle's murder. So investigators had to rely on forensic evidence to find out the truth. Michelle Salerno, 26-year-old graduate student, was missing and presumed murdered.
Okay, I keep it there. That's what I asked me. You guys are blaming me for all kinds of crap.
Her estranged husband, Dennis, told police his best friend, Larry McClanahan, killed her. He's found preposterous.
We investigated it, and we were never able to determine that McClanahan had anything to do with Michelle's murder or disappearance.
Interestingly, police found Michelle's abandoned car just 10 miles from the truck stop where Salerno killed McClanahan. Inside Michelle's car, investigators found Dennis Salerno's fingerprint on the passenger side window. Michelle got the car after Dennis had moved out.
The fact that her dad had recently given her the car does minimize the possibility that his fingerprints could or should be there.
Next, investigators went through Salerno's personal belongings.
Dennis had two storage lockers, one in DeWitt, Michigan, and one in Ohio. In both of these storage areas, he had a pack rat mentality. He kept everything he ever owned or had in the past.
Inside were computers, pornographic pictures, a professional lock-picking set, and one of Michelle's letters addressed to the court.
We found numerous documents, one of which being a personal protection order application that Michelle had filled out that Dennis should not have been in possession of at all.
course of our marriage, he has been physically and mentally abusive toward me.
Investigators sent the letter to forensic scientist Greg Michaud, who sprayed it with menhydrin.
Menhydrin is a chemical that we use to react with the amino acids in the fingerprint residuals that are left behind. When the menhydrin does react, the fingerprints become visible in a purple color.
On this document, Michaud found prints from two different individuals.
There were two palm prints that identified Dennis Salerno, and there were three fingerprints that we were able to identify as Michelle Salerno.
Investigators believe Dennis stole this letter from Michelle's apartment.
That letter was drafted the night before her death.
Dennis was not residing with her, and there's no reason that his prints should have ever been on that letter.
But Dennis Salerno continued to deny he killed his estranged wife, Michelle, insisting his friend, Larry McClanahan, did.
Well, it's a great alibi to be able to accuse someone of a homicide when they're dead. Because you can pin everything on that dead person, and the dead person cannot talk.
He was caught on the McClanahan murder, and the prosecutor there were putting together a possible death penalty case against him. And we came to that agreement. If he told us where the body was, we wouldn't use that information in a trial against him, and the Ohio prosecutors would seek only a 20-year prison sentence for the murder of McClanahan.
So Salerno took the deal and gave investigators the location of Michelle's body.
He told us that Larry McClanahan had told him that he had buried Michelle on top of this dump site, which was 10 acres, and it was a large area, a huge dump site.
After several days of searching, investigators finally found a woman's body. They needed some way to make an identification.
I got a hold of Michelle's mom and said, "Do you by chance still have one of Michelle's baby teeth?" So she gave us one or two of the baby teeth. There was still enough of the pulp or dentine present that they were finally able to get a known sample of her DNA.
The DNA confirmed the body was Michelle Salerno. She had been strangled to death.
There was a defect in the hyoid bone, which is a three-part bone in your throat, which is generally a good indicator that strangulation has been a mechanism of death.
I feel like the weight of the world has been lifted off your shoulders once you finally found her. And then of course, what you've hoped for so long can be very devastating.
Investigators were convinced that Dennis Salerno was involved in Michelle's murder, especially when they found a lock-picking set in his possession and a pair of mud cake shoes in his storage locker.
These just stuck out because they had been rolled up inside the floor mat of the car. Detective Quick was in charge of taking care of the trace evidence at that time, and got a hold of a professor at Michigan State University who we called the Dirt Doctor.
The dirt doctor was Tom Vogel, a professor of geological sciences.
I always thought they called me the rock doctor.
He said, "My results here could actually be damaging to your investigation because if my results are found to be generic, that could actually give Dennis Salerno an alibi as far as him not being there."
Vogel took samples from Salerno's shoes and from Michelle's body. He ground each one to a fine powder, then heated the samples to 1,000 degrees centigrade. He did the same for the dirt sample from the landfill. And this soil was the most unique.
I'd never seen anything like it before in my life. When they brought the materials back, I saw, wow, these are really unusual soils. Soils that had high levels of metals like nickel, zinc, and even hafnium, which is probably the most unusual metal to find in the soil.
Astonishingly, the dirt on Salerno's shoes matched the dirt found on Michelle's body, and the dirt wasn't from the landfill.
That body had been moved. She was definitely buried someplace else first. The soil that was right on in contact with the body did not have these heavy metals.
This meant that Michelle's body had been previously
this evidence and shows that he is involved in the burial of his wife.
Friends of Michelle and Dennis Salerno say their relationship was doomed from the start. They eloped after knowing each other for only a month. Michelle's parents were appalled.
I just wanted to find out more about Dennis since we knew very little about him. So I hired a private investigator, and he uncovered his criminal past. That was more shocking to me than when she got married. I was just really upset about that.
When Michelle found out about her husband's criminal past, she asked for a divorce.
She had found out that he was a homosexual, found out that he had been in prison, and they had had several domestic arguments that someone would get hurt, either he or she would get hurt.
Although Dennis and Michelle were living separately, Michelle feared for her safety. The forensic evidence shows that Dennis entered Michelle's apartment while she was at work, possibly to pick up some of his things. He found the protection order she planned to file against him. He was incensed. And when she returned from her job delivering newspapers, he strangled her to death. No one knows how he got her body outside and into her car, or where he first buried her. But mud found on Salerno's shoes matched the dirt on Michelle's body. Later, he moved her body to the landfill in Ohio. Then abandoned Michelle's car, leaving his fingerprint on the window. To cover his tracks, Salerno needed someone to take the blame for Michelle's murder. He chose his old prison cellmate, Larry McClanahan. He lured him to the truck stop and slit his throat.
Dennis tried to pin Clanahan as killing his wife, when in fact later on it came out that Dennis knew exactly where Michelle was buried, and the shoes in which he found in Dennis's locker being his, the soil on his shoes were matched up to the soil samples on Michelle's body.
Dennis Salerno pleaded guilty to Larry McClanahan's murder, but not guilty to Michelle's murder. However, and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without parole.
You don't have to prove motive, only have to prove cause of death. And that was Dennis Salerno that did it. And the evidence was really overwhelming when looked at as a whole.
The forensic evidence proved Salerno handled Michelle's court-related documents. But the most unusual evidence was the forensic geology.
The key that tied him to the murder was the dirt evidence, the unusual quality of the dirt as described by the scientist in this case. How he would have had that on his shoes and it be on her body is only explained by it being associated with that body and its burial.
Without the soil samples, we wouldn't have been able to say that Dennis was responsible for this murder, because those soil samples alone
brother's killer, but can't identify him.
There was nothing. She was a complete blank.
With no other evidence, the case turns cold.
After Kathy was laid to rest, I was always struggling, trying to find out who could have done this.
Until forensic scientists decided to play act the crime.
Basically what we were doing was we were strangling each other.
And when they did, found evidence hidden for 15 years.
It takes science and luck to solve cases. In this case, it took a lot of luck.
Mike Odom met Kathy Martin in high school. They dated and soon decided to make a life together. But before they could get married, Mike was arrested for selling heroin. A mistake that put him behind bars for 2 years.
I remember while he was in the penitentiary, and Kathy was dead set on waiting on him to get out to date him again, which she did.
Shortly after his release, Mike and Kathy did get married and had 2 children, Tasha and Sean. Kathy's father even gave Mike a job working in his sign business.
Kathy was set on making the marriage work, did everything she could.
Things were going well until one night when Mike couldn't get in touch with Kathy, who said she'd be home with the 2 children. Kathy didn't answer the phone, so Mike called his next-door neighbor and asked him to see if anything was wrong.
The neighbor went over, beat on the door, nobody answered. He looked in, and I think the TV was going. There was just something suspicious.
But instead of calling police, the neighbor drove a quarter-mile into town, found a policeman, and they both went back to the Odom's house together. The officer entered the unlocked house. Inside, on the living room sofa, was 4-year-old Tasha, beaten and unconscious, but still alive. He found 2-month-old Sean unharmed in the back room. In the next room, he found Kathy Odom on the floor, naked and covered in blood. She'd been stabbed to death. An ambulance rushed 4-year-old Tasha to the hospital. When Kathy's father arrived at the scene, police told him little about what had happened.
I said, "Where's the children?" He said, "Well, the children have been taken to the hospital." And he said that would be a good place for you to go and check on the children.
Frank described to me what it was like to be sitting in the hospital, and he looked up at a TV set, and that's when he learned that his daughter had been killed.
I didn't know that at the time, and I seen that. Well, I went outside the hospital and sat down, cried a long time, until I got myself back together a little bit I never did go back to the house that night, which was strange.
When Mike Odom got there, police paid special attention to his appearance.
Mike Odom, the husband, drives up, and he's wearing blue jeans and a blue shirt, and one of the investigators notices that he's got stains on his shirt. Is that blood? Is it not blood?
A search of the Odom's home revealed blood in the bathroom, which meant the killer had cleaned up before leaving. But police found no evidence of a break-in. All the doors were locked except the front door. This indicated Kathy probably knew her killer. Kathy Odom's autopsy showed she had been stabbed 19 times and sexually assaulted.
This is a crime of passion, that it's not a stranger killing, because why would a stranger feel the need to stab her 16 times plus slash her throat 3 more times?
Kathy Odom's clothes told police something about what happened.
She took them off, she folded them up deliberately. You know, her clothes haven't been ripped off of her, so she voluntarily took her clothes off.
Police believe that the killer attacked Kathy Odom's daughter, Tasha, in order to make Kathy do whatever he wanted.
Number one, it would make Tasha stop crying. And more importantly, it would convince Kathy that he's serious and she better go along with what he's gonna do.
Apparently, the killer used a cord from a nearby lamp and bound Kathy's wrists before sexually assaulting her, then stabbing her to death.
In the end, she ended up losing her life while she was protecting herself and her children.
As family members tried to cope with Kathy's murder, they prayed for 4-year-old Tasha's recovery.
They had Tasha on IVs. She was in a coma state. She had been beaten bad.
As doctors worked on the little girl, police talked to her father, Mike.
His emotions, I mean, he was emotional, he was distraught, but there were some people that at the scene that thought, well, we need to look at this person a little bit more.
Also suspicious, Mike Odom didn't come straight home after work on the night Kathy was murdered. Instead, he went out with friends. That's why he was calling his wife that night, to let her know he'd be late.
We've seen it before where an individual has arranged a murder. He's at another location. He calls the person, go check on my wife. So we're always suspicious of the husband until we can get him cleared out.
When police interviewed Mike Odom, they saw stains on his shirt, which was taken to the forensic lab for testing. Police also found suspicious stains on the floor mats of Tim Robinson's car, the neighbor who first contacted police.
We had to get the floor mat. We had to send it to the lab and have it tested.
The medical examiner estimated that Kathy Odom was murdered about 6 hours before her body was found, which would have been about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Mike Odom and his neighbor Tim Robinson both claimed to be at work at the time. While investigators checked their alibis, they got a potential witness. Tasha Odom emerged from her coma and told investigators she remembered a man entering the house and coming up to her.
What Tasha could remember was that the person put their hands up over their face. And so that tells you right there, they knew Tasha. She said, he had yellow hair like you, Nanny. Your hair yellow.
Mike Odom didn't have blonde hair, and neither did Tim Robinson. But the killer's hair color was all Tasha could remember.
There was nothing. She was a complete blank. She remembered nothing.
When the forensic tests came back, the stains in Tim Robinson's car turned out to be motor oil. The stains on Mike Odom's shirt were paint. In addition, co-workers provided solid alibis for both of them, and they each passed polygraphs.
If they don't have anything to do with it, then we want to get them cleared out as quickly as possible so we can move on to the next person.
And that next person was mentioned by everyone who knew Kathy. It was her brother-in-law, Greg Marquardt.
Everyone knew their relationship and that it wasn't good, that he had this weird obsession for her, that she didn't like him, that she was afraid of him, and that he had tried to make advances toward her before, to put a move on her before, and she didn't like it.
And there was ample evidence Greg had been in the house.
They found his fingerprints, his hair throughout the scene.
There was only one problem. As a family member who'd been in the house numerous times, this didn't prove a thing. The only witness to Kathy Odom's murder, her 4-year-old daughter Tasha, had sustained a massive blow to her head.
She had injuries to her face with swelling and everything, and it would appear that she was hit, with a fist.
But after 2 days in a coma, Tasha rallied. Before her release from the hospital, her uncle, Greg Marquardt, came to visit. It was an encounter Tasha's grandmother would never forget.
Hi, Greg. How's she doing? Better. How about you guys?
Tasha, when she saw Greg, she looked over at me like scared to death. Look.
When they asked little Tasha whether it was her uncle Greg who entered the house on the day of the attack, she said she couldn't remember.
They try different things to try to bring out those memories. At one point, they even hypnotized her, hoping they could find some grain of memory.
She was so traumatized, she never recalled it.
35-year-old Greg Marquardt had been married to Kathy Odom's sister, Shelley, for 4 years. Shelley and Greg had served time in prison for possession of cocaine.
It's the drug scene of the 80s they were caught up in.
In fact, one of the reasons Kathy wanted to move to a new house was to get away from Greg, who had made many sexual advances toward her.
She was scared of Greg. She said, I would not want to be alone with him by myself.
Oddly, despite these rebuffs, Greg Marquardt was surprisingly open about his attraction to Kathy, particularly to one part of her body.
He had a thing for Kathy's tummy, which is sort of odd. I mean, why would he pay attention to her tummy and be obsessed by that?
This fixation was so obvious, Kathy talked about it with friends.
Kathy even would say, I don't know what it is, but he's just, there's something about my stomach that, and he wants to have sex with me.
I've heard of people having fetishes with feet or hands, but that's the first one having a fetish with a stomach that I've heard of.
Coincidentally, Kathy Odom had been stabbed repeatedly in the stomach.
And these are deep, penetrating wounds.
When questioned by police, Marquardt denied any involvement, but said little else.
At some point in that detective's interview, Greg said, excuse me, I need to go out and put money into the parking meter. He got up, he left, he never came back.
Greg's wife, Shelley, the victim's sister, said Greg drove her to school at 10:30 on the day of the murder and picked her up again at 2:30. This 4-hour window was more than enough time for Greg to commit the murder and clean up before picking up his wife from school.
The way I would describe Shelley is she's extremely codependent and absolutely was under the control of Greg Marquardt. This much I know, that he got her hooked on heroin, which to me is the worst thing that a human being could do to another one.
An analysis of the crime scene provided little help. Greg's fingerprints and hairs were found in Kathy's house, but other family members' prints were found there as well.
He was her brother-in-law, and he had been to the house before, so it was natural that you would find his fingerprints and his hairs.
Although Kathy had been sexually assaulted, this crime occurred years before DNA was widely used in murder investigations.
At the time, in the 1980s, they were using serology. Basically, they were doing blood group typing. And it was very difficult. You need a very large sample. And plus, you would only get a blood type.
The blood type from the rape kit was consistent with Greg Marquardt's blood type.
He was a type O. About 50% of the population is a type O. So that's not giving you much information.
So, without more evidence, the case went cold.
After Kathy was laid to rest and time went on, I found myself at the cemetery most all the time, but I was always struggling trying to find out who could have done this.
They say if you don't solve the crime within a month with all the fresh leads, that's not a possibility there that you would.
Greg and Shelley Marquardt went on with their lives, but for Kathy's father, it was especially difficult.
The idea that he had to go through his daughter's murder and then live believing for all those years with all his heart that the man who did it was married to his other daughter. Can you imagine what that would be like?
It took 11 years before DNA testing became dependable enough to generate a DNA profile from the biological evidence in Kathy Odom's rape kit. When that profile was compared to Greg Marquardt's DNA, it wasn't 100% conclusive, but it did show that Greg was among the 2% of the general population who could have been the perpetrator.
Well, when this came forward, I thought sure we had him.
But Greg had an explanation. He claimed he and Kathy were having
a consensual affair and was with her on the morning of her murder, but he insisted she was alive when he left.
Greg Marquardt was not arrested at that time because the district attorney we were talking to did not feel like we could get a conviction on this case with him saying at that time I was having an affair with him, that we were having consensual sex.
They would have to prove that Greg was there that day, and that Greg was there to murder Kathy. But how would they do it? It had been 4 years since DNA testing showed that Greg Marquardt was among the 2% of the general population who could have sexually assaulted and presumably murdered Kathy Odom. But investigators weren't sure how to counter Greg's claim that he was involved in a consensual affair with Kathy around the time of her murder. While this was taking place, investigators were working with Catherine Long at Orchid Cellmark, a private forensic lab in Dallas.
Catherine Long, her dad, was the chief of police in El Paso, Texas, so she thinks a little differently than your normal scientist.
And Cellmark was doing some unusual experiments at the time.
Basically what we were doing was we were strangling each other.
Not for fun. It was business to determine whether a killer would deposit skin cells in the act of choking a victim.
We would swab their neck. We would also swab the hands of the person who performed the choking.
That's when they realized there was a significant transfer of skin cells.
And it was actually very high.
Investigators needed to find something in Kathy's evidence file that would have contained the perpetrator's skin cells. The answer was the electrical cord used to bind Kathy's hands.
Anytime you go anywhere, you leave a piece of yourself behind, be it skin cells, be it a hair follicle, be it a fingerprint.
In an incredible piece of luck, the cord had been stored not in a plastic bag, but a paper bag.
That paper bag provides breathability, so that if there is any moisture on that item, it's going to dry, and that will therefore prolong the DNA life. It will actually preserve the DNA longer than it would in a plastic bag.
The cord was covered in blood, so scientists swabbed the cord for the blood and any skin cells that existed with the blood. Testing revealed 2 genetic profiles. One was Kathy Odom's DNA. The other was Greg Marquardt's. The only way Marquardt's DNA would have been on the bloody electrical cord found wrapped around Kathy's hands was if he were the killer. Greg Marquardt was arrested and charged with Kathy Odom's murder. In prison, Marquardt told the whole chilling story to a fellow inmate. Marquardt said he was high on heroin when he drove to Kathy's house that day. Once inside, he made a sexual advance, which she rejected. To force her to comply, he struck his 4-year-old niece Tasha repeatedly in the head, leaving her for dead. The baby, Sean, was in the next room. And Greg threatened to kill him too. In order to save the baby's life, Kathy complied. Using a knife from the kitchen, Greg cut the electrical cord from a lamp and bound Kathy's wrist, leaving his DNA on the cord. After he sexually assaulted Kathy, he stabbed her to death. He washed up in the bathroom and changed into Kathy's husband's clothing to keep blood out of his car. Little did Marquardt know, advances in science would be able to identify him as the perpetrator 15 years later.
God justice. God knows what we're going to have in 10 years or 20 years. It's even better and more advanced than what we have now. It's amazing.
When faced with this evidence, Greg Marquardt pled guilty to Kathy's murder and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He died of liver disease after serving 4 years of his sentence. He was 56 years old.
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. That's the way I feel about it.
Doesn't bring back Kathy. I'll always remember her. The house she put together, the things we did. It's tough to lose a child, but thank the good Lord for everything he did.
It's just one of those cases that, I guess it makes you proud to be a part of, that we were able to have a good ending to it, and that's just filing on it. That Greg was not able to get away with murder in this case, but there's a lot more out there that are still unsolved.
Shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It might have been just another statistic, but the crime committed that night launched a new era in police investigations. This is how DNA evidence and psychological profiling helped catch a serial killer and set an innocent man free.
Everything about her is very gentle. She's very soft-spoken. Just had this amazing softness about